The Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. A couple of quick announcements. One of our regular members has returned 2 books that the group, I think, had purchased. Having read them, they wanted to pass it on if there was somebody else who wanted one of the books. So both of these books are available up front if somebody would like to pick one of them up. And I also want to say that we have a schedule up here. And next week is Nick, and I cannot pronounce his last name. I apologize. Samwe Luke. Did I get it close enough?
No.
Okay. We're going back to a topic that came up in our book. He's presenting an Adventist case for being pro-life. March 2nd, Barbara Cowden Hernandez, some of you may know her, is going to continue the recent research in spirituality and health, which is the topic for today as well. And then Rodney Porker will be talking about neuroplasticity, theology, and morality. So we hope to see you here for those. I would like to introduce Iris this morning, and most Americans would pronounce her last name Mamier, right? Or is that the...
That's what most say.
Yes, but it is French, so you can leave the R off. She is an associate professor here at Loma University, the School of Nursing, and one of her passions, if I may use that word, is spirituality and health, doing research in that, particularly from the point of view of nursing a patient and how that connects. And I'm going to let you tell your own story with your slides. So we're so glad that you could come to our Sabbath school today.
Thank you so much, Laura. Is the mic in a way that you can all hear me? That's good. Well, I am delighted to be here with you this morning. When Laura sent that email and said all those who presented during the faculty fall colloquium are invited to present at this Sabbath school, I was blown away. I thought, wow, how fresh. And I already thought that in September last year when we presented. It's funny. I've presented my research as far as Prague and Puerto Rico and other places, but very little of that I have done here in our own university. And so I am delighted for the opportunity to share with you a little bit what I have been doing in the area of nurse spiritual care. Maybe a little bit of a background of myself. I am originally from Europe, as you noticed with my accent right away. I was affiliated with the Adventist Hospital in Berlin. Waldfriede was the dean of the School of Nursing at Waldfriede before coming to the US. In 2002, our School of Nursing launched the first PhD nursing program in Adventism. It's no longer the only, but at the time it was, and I'm delighted that Dr. Jones is here. She played a huge role in inviting me to join that very first cohort of PhD students here. So basically my professional socialization was in Europe up until master's in a secular system, and here I come for my PhD to Loma. And I was already an educator, so not so close to practice anymore. More on my mind were educational questions and my background with social behavioral research impacted. And so then all of a sudden I had the resources of a vibrant religion department in front of me. And needless to say that I took a lot of the religion courses. Maybe religion or theology is my secret love. So that's probably as close as I, as a nurse, can get to it. And I felt like studying spirituality at the intersection of health and religion on the other side seemed like a very promising venture. Besides that, it is something that I could have not anticipated to study at a secular university. So that sort of got me started. Another starting point is kind of, let's assess what we have here in the United States. I understand we have 5 health systems, Adventist health systems, sailing under Adventist flag. And we are, as Adventists, proud that basically in this country and in many other countries, Adventism has moved forward on 2 legs, right? One is the health work, the other is education. And here at Loma Linda, the 2 come together, okay? So, 5 health systems, about 92 or 93 hospitals in the North American division. You would think that we know all about spiritual care, right? That we are the pacemakers, that we are the ones moving the boundaries when it comes to this topic. And yet, there's not too much published by Adventists. You will be inviting, or you have invited also Beth Johnston-Taylor, my dear colleague. I hope that she will also come. She is one voice who has contributed to that discussion. But, and that's what Dr. Koenig pointed out in fall. Why aren't you guys the ones who set the standards when it comes to health and spirituality research? What is happening? Where are you? With this, I must admit that that topic caused me a lot of questions initially, and I don't know if I have the answers by now, but I am taking a bold step. Let's see. I think it should be. This is a surprise that came very recently. Before Christmas, I was surprised by getting an invitation by a Catholic health system that is in the area where AUC used to be. In fact, I learned that we send, or AUC sent, their nurses for their clinicals to the Catholic hospital nearby because there's no Adventist hospital there. And the lady, Marie Romagnano, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing her name right, she, since not only had she read my research articles, but she also, we had a little Zoom conference together, and she told me that what started her work with Divine Mercy healthcare professionals was the 9/11 event. A national catastrophe, a catastrophe that has changed the world, as we would all readily acknowledge nowadays. And she said when that was happening, the White House called on her and her nurses to possibly come and provide spiritual support. And she realized since then that there is still a calling for Christian nurses to fill a gap. I think that obviously we increasingly have with our rational and very scientific-oriented medicine. There is something that is falling through the cracks. And it's often the moments of human hardship and catastrophes that bring that to the foreground, that there is something more going on than just solving the puzzle of how can this disease be remedied. So she contacted me and said, here, you're from Loma Linda. You have done research in that area. Would it be possible for you to be a speaker at the 15th, annual Divine Mercy Medicine, Bioethics, and Spirituality Conference? And I looked at this and I said, whoo, this is even more out of the box than talking to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. That's going to take me out of my Adventist cocoon in which I had gotten so comfortable over the last 16 years. And it's going to take me into a world. So since my husband is a convert from the RCC to Adventism, I said, okay, I'm going to take him with me. Because Nurse Mary told me I'm going to be meeting with the bishop there also. So it's going to be exciting, and it's going to be a fresh new dialogue. And I thought, well, how do I even connect with this Marian branch of the Roman Catholic Church on the topic of spirituality? What do we share? What do we have in common? And I was reminded of a Sabbath school I once taught with Alyssa Kido. We were featuring the prodigal son. And I'd like to suggest to you, at the time we were so excited, we had so much fun preparing the Sabbath school, we came over the work of Henri Nouwen. And Henri Nouwen's reflections start based on Rembrandt's drawing or picture of the return of the prodigal son. And I'd like to read real quick with you this morning, since it's Sabbath, the parable of the lost son. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and he is alive again. He was lost and he is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, You kill the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead, and he is alive again. He was lost, and he is found. Why am I referring to the story this morning? To me, this story sets the stage for spiritual care. Whether we are the younger brother who decides there's nothing more he can get out of the relationship with the father once he has the money in his pockets and leaves, or whether we are the older brother who still hangs around the church and whose heart is very distant to the father, because he sees the father as this severe, exacting, demanding, obedience-demanding monarch, more like a slave trader than like a gentle father. In whatever distortions about God we may be trapped physically close to him, or far away in a foreign country. I think the story of the prodigal son is the story of the human race. It's our story. Our story of alienation from God. An illness, losing one's health, is often a point at which people reevaluate their life. They are forced to stop the rat race. They are forced to think, how are things going to go on? Kind of like the younger son who was with his, hitting rock bottom, reevaluating, is that really the way I want to live? And is there maybe a reason to go back to the Father's house? I think we could have a rich discussion just thinking as clinicians what that beautiful story that Jesus told could tell us as healthcare providers. Henri Nouwen, the priest from Yale who lived the last few years of his life in a home, a permanent home of handicapped, mentally handicapped individuals, ministering to the handicapped. He was touched by the Father's embrace, the gentleness of the Father's embrace that expresses who the Father really is. At this point, the Son knew what kind of a Father he had. It was the story of a homecoming, and I think the question of whether it is worthwhile, whether the kind of God that God is a God that I want to come home to, is an underlying question as we provide spiritual care. That I would like to suggest the touch of the healthcare provider can be the touch of our Heavenly Father. So, with this context, where we have already established, we talk a lot about whole person care at Loma. We mentioned spiritual care. And the starting point of my dissertation was the question, is it really happening? I wanted to know if it does, how much of it is happening. And I wanted to know what is going on in our very own institution. So at the time, that was before we had the Heart and Surgical Hospital, we had 4 campuses, and we didn't have Marietta yet. At the time, that was in 2008-9, we had a nursing workforce of over 2,300 nurses. And I sent an email to all of them, inviting them to participate in an online survey and to tell me how much spiritual care they have provided based on 17 items in the last 72 to 80 hours at work. So and we looked at, in the analysis, whether there were differences between the medical center and the children's hospital and the BMC and East Campus. We looked around whether the frequency of nurse spiritual care differed, and it did. And of course, you can play around. You can now go to medical specialties. You can look at the area of oncology. What would you predict? Yes, you're right. You predict that there's more spiritual care there, and there was. And some of the questions we really didn't know. We didn't know whether you see more spiritual care on the intensive care unit than you see on a step-down unit. Right? But all these kind of analyses we ran, so we got a pretty good understanding at the factors that are associated with providing spiritual care. And they basically range around three areas. One has to do with nurse demographics. One has to do with the spiritual religious profile of the nurse. And the third has to do with the workplace, the work environment. Yeah. So we developed a predictor model. I mean, for some of you, particularly if you're at home in the basic sciences, this is pretty challenging for your mind, isn't it? How do you even measure something like spiritual care, an abstract concept? How do you make that measurable? Some would dispute that it's even real. Some would say, that's just in your mind, and it's not even there. Well, in the social behavioral science model, you capture it by a definition. And then you generate items from the literature. Actually, there is an ongoing and very vivid discussion in the nursing literature, but also in the larger healthcare literature about the role of spirituality. It is funny that as we witness that many people drop organized religion, religion shows up in unexpected places in a field that is supposedly a secular field, in the workplaces. It's an interesting phenomenon that has intrigued sociologists of religion. And that also influenced a little bit of my work. Anyway, we developed then items. The items were then tested for content validity with the special metrics by nurse experts who had funded research in the area of spiritual care. And so we kind of condensed it from a set of 34 items to 17 items that we then actually tested with our nurses. Put a Likert scale to it, and then looked, how much did they endorse having provided spiritual care in over a certain amount of time. So what do you do with such a tool? Well, the Loma Linda nursing data have basically become the comparison point. Because before that, there was nothing in the literature. Okay? So spiritual care at Loma Linda becomes now the standard. Others can, now that the tool is published, use the tool and look elsewhere. And we had a few nurses who contacted us. One was working with palliative nurses, and one was working with a similar secular health system in Ohio. So we published then a study that compares nurse spiritual care practice in the United States. And people have interest in translating the tool, so we will probably see more of it even from places like Turkey or China, which should be exciting given that religion is somewhat of a taboo in some of these countries, or at least difficult. Yeah? Mm-hmm. I already alluded at the sociology of religion framework. Taking another lens, I was also interested in what the nurses' stories were about spiritual care. And I didn't ask them straight out, how do you provide spiritual care? Or give me a description of a situation. I used actually the wording that I had gleaned from sociologists of religion working in Tucson, Arizona at a secular health system. We asked them and said, tell me about an experience with spirituality at work that greatly impacted the way you see spirituality. And to our surprise, I mean, once you work busy nurses through a survey for 20 minutes, you predict an open-ended question at the end of a survey will not have very many takers. Big surprise. Over 300 nurses responded, with some with a short comment, but some with an elaborate story. Those stories, I wished we could look at them more closely, but they reflected then basically experiences and situations in which spiritual care can emerge in the context of providing care. So, and the sociologists of religion say that these experiences can either have a confirmatory or compensatory function, and that they can happen as marginal or as institutional experiences. And I used that system to basically look and classify with a group of doctoral students where these stories that we had gathered here at Loma Linda fit into that matrix. What is so special about this is that it is a matrix that differentiates between basically engaging experiences with spirituality or disengaging experiences. What we saw was predominantly engaging experiences with spirituality. Not only did the nurses engage, but having engaged in spiritual care or in allowing that spiritual component of a complex health situation to really come to the forefront, did something with them as healthcare providers. It changed them. It gave them a significant experience of meaning and purpose, and of experiencing, I'm making a difference. And when you look at what motivates people to go into nursing, into medicine, into the helping professions, at the get-go, at the start, when you do student interviews, it's the motivation to do something that makes a difference for someone else, to make this world a little bit better. These nurses who engaged had that experience. And I think it is probably encouraging them, when a situation comes again, to pick it up again and to make themselves available. The reverse is also true. people who cannot deal with that spiritual stuff experience a great deal of discomfort around it. Problem? If the spiritual comes to the forefront to the patient, in the patient's experience. And mind you, in a medical center of this size, it is often a life and death matter. Real people die here. So there can be, patients may be facing some very real questions here. It may be problematic if the healthcare provider cannot deal with it. And what we saw in the stories, that disengaging means basically building a wall to the patient, a distance. Give you an example. Pediatric care. It's very difficult for any parent to be okay with that kid, that is my kid, dying. There is a desire in any parent to fight and to hope for God's intervention. And I tell you, there's often an army of church-going believers praying for that miracle to happen. But the nurse that buys into a scientific model where there is no room for miracles says, they are delusional. They are just simply in denial about reality. I cannot deal with the faith of these parents. What's happening? You distance. And you go then straight to the medical facts and you attend to those. But you basically leave the family in their spiritual journey alone. Now, it may be good practice to say, you know what, I realize that I have reached my limitations here. But as a professional nurse, I would at least expect the nurse to recognize what is going on and not just distance herself or himself, but say, you know what, this family may need someone who is a professional in that area. They may need someone who can provide professional spiritual support. A follow-up study that we did was also nationally. We had a co-author who is the editor of the Journal of Christian Nursing. It's a journal that has a subscription by about 5,000 nurses, both here in the United States as well as internationally. And she, together with the Center of Spiritual Life and Wholeness, with Kalagoba, and Beth Johnson-Taylor and I, we teamed up and said, okay, let's place an ad in that Journal of Christian Nursing and invite them to share their, what they think is appropriate behavior, what they think is not appropriate behavior, what they would do when they offer prayer or not offer prayer. So we looked at kind of the ethicalness or the actual practice, and then we evaluated the ethicalness of the behavior of Christian nurses that was reported through an online survey. But there was a qualitative subcomponent in this study that was was very, very exciting to explore. And that is the question, how do Christian nurses pray with patients? Now, even at a secular university in Tucson, Arizona, we know that 70% of their nursing workforce say that they have at least prayed once with a patient. That doesn't tell us much about how frequently that happens, but also it tells us that it is not totally unusual If you were to go to the UK, you would have a very different context for prayer. So we simplified the case scenario that we gave to these Christian nurses a little bit in that we said it's patient-initiated. Imagine a surgical patient ready to go to be brought to the OR. Patient says, nurse, would you pray with me before I go? This spares us the discussion about the ethicalness because it's patient-initiated, right? But in the literature, nowhere to be found is how do Christian healthcare providers pray with their patients? We had no idea. And mind you, you would expect that anyone leaving our programs has heard something about praying with patients and how to do it right. Well, this study was exciting because I learned a lot from it. Basically, there are 5 phases: open, setting the stage, request, wrap up, and close. Number 1, 3, and 5 are in every prayer. But the more refined prayers have also phase 2 and phase 4. They don't just go in and say, "Dear God, please be with Mrs. Smith. Thank you, amen." Instead, they're thoughtful about how they address God. I mean, the minute you open up a prayer, you have to make a decision on how to refer to the divine. Are you using your language? Are you using the language that is appropriate for the patient? Are you praying to Mary? Are you praying to Jesus? To God? To Allah? Big decisions already from the get-go. How a healthcare provider in prayer sets the stage, kind of this arriving in God's presence. We learned that by looking at these prayers. And then the request is given, and then the question is, how do you prepare for landing again? How do you prepare for leaving God's presence? And these nurses are teaching us that there are beautiful ways of doing it. And then they end the prayer. Most prayers end with amen, not surprising, okay? So that piece is waiting to be published hopefully very soon in the Journal of Christian Nursing. And I think it has implications because this is something we can teach. There is no reason for anyone graduating from a faith-based university to be totally surprised by a patient asking for prayer. At the very minimum, anyone graduating in healthcare should have a decision or have it clear in their mind, will they accept or will they not? If they decline, which is their right, what are you offering instead? You cannot just brush off patients' expressed spiritual needs. You have to do something about it. So these things need to be thought about. And plus, what we did with our nurse participants is something that we could do in addition with any nursing student. Write out your prayer. Read it to one another. You know, how does that prayer make me feel when you pray like that for me? You can give each other collegial feedback, okay? And as they understand the structure, they can build it. This is something that we can learn. And the pitfalls also can be learned. Okay, I think I will stop at this point because the time is there for Q&A. Oops, that was a little too fast. Here. Thank you for listening. Now it's time for your questions.
Okay, your questions. your talk makes me weep for the opportunity and the joy that this kind of nursing can bring. I think, you know, not only, and it's completely appropriate what you've suggested about writing out prayers, something that you feel comfortable with, and that would not be, shall I say, guilt-producing for the patient. And I guess I feel like this has to do so much with our understanding of what kind of a God we have. I went to a seminar at the White when they were celebrating their centennial a while ago, and a Jewish physician spoke about how to avoid burnout in healthcare. And her bottom line on that was recognize the holiness of what you're doing. These are human beings destined for heaven according to God's will. One experience I had when I was functioning as a chaplain, and I was called in the middle of the night to minister to a lady who had given birth to a child that had been born out of her marriage. She was trying to cover up the fact that this baby, she had been pregnant and so forth, the baby was born way prematurely and was not going to survive the night. She had put the baby up for adoption. And so I was called, the baby was dying, she was holding the baby. There was no adoptive mother there, you know, to comfort the baby, hold the baby. And I wanted to divest myself of this holiness, sanctity thing of being from the chaplain's office. I was a human being. I was a mother as she was. But if we can convey what kind of a God he is. And I wanted to say, oops, when you said closing the prayer, leaving God's presence, I want to say, no way. I am committing this child, this mother, this situation to God's presence and the kind of a loving God we have.
Thank you.
In a community where the patients are so, their religion is so diverse, if we're not totally sure of how to pray, shouldn't we focus on being culturally sensitive, using good bedside manners, and being generally loving people? Is that a good place to stay? Because sometimes if you mention Jesus as God to a Jewish person or a Muslim person, it doesn't sit well. So knowing how to pray, and you know, not everyone knows how to pray. But I think being culturally sensitive, caring for people, and that alone goes a long way.
Yes. Thank you very much. That's exactly what the study, the prayer analysis, brought to the forefront for us. There are some good assessment questions. And nurses who do this well and routinely, they would go and ask these questions. How do you refer to the divine? What would you like me to pray about? Yeah? We think we know. We think it is the distress for this upcoming surgery. But no, mother is distressed over the father with the 3 children being at home and things getting chaotic at home. So, you know, yes, that's exactly the reason why it's not enough to be Adventist and to be trained at a faith-based university. We need, in this day and age, we owe it, in fact, to our students that we teach them in a way that they can ethically correct and in the most forward-moving manner address spirituality and prayer in a professional context without getting in trouble for it afterwards. We owe it to them.
Thank you, Dr. Mamier, for your presentation. It's an interesting topic. You started your presentation with the beautiful parable of the prodigal son. And you concluded that the prodigal son, found peace in the father's house. Well, in my view, this is more religion than spirituality. Because I believe being religious and having spirituality are 2 different things. Being religious means to have a relation with God and put your total trust in Him. have an intimate relationship with Him. But you can be spiritual but not religious. Because in my view, spirituality means finding peace and equilibrium and tranquility in your inner, in your dwelling into your own consciousness, and finding there, in your own strength, peace and tranquility and purpose for your life. Then we know that spirituality means many things for many people, and it is not just prayer. It means Zen Buddhism, and means meditation, and means many other things. And that I was very, very interested to see the wide range of spiritual practices, because the most researchers are agreeing that by spirituality we don't heal entirely a patient, but we can improve his situation. I don't know if you agree with that, but this is what I read about. And in your view, what do you think really spirituality role is in all of this? Now, in regard to Loma Linda, I will say that when Loma Linda came up with this motto to make men whole, I didn't discover something new, because it was there in existence for at least 2,000 years, when the old Romans said mens sana in corpore sano, which is to have a healthy mind in a healthy body. Then it's a direct relationship between a healthy mind and a healthy body. What do you think about all this?
Wow. How much time do we have? No, I think you're pointing out a lot of very pertinent points. Number one, the artificial boundary between religion and spirituality has a lot to do with postmodern thinking. Okay? As clinicians of any healthcare profession, I think we have seen value in moving to a spirituality language rather than a religion language, because religion has a package for some people in their lives. They are more comfortable to talk about spirituality than about religion, although you could very well argue, when you look at the conceptual definitions, that either the properties are overlapping or it is exactly the same. What has happened in practice is, I tell you, 30 years ago, if you had had an atheist patient and you had said, "Are you spiritual?" they would have been offended that you even assume. That is no longer the case. Nowadays, if you as a healthcare provider, because there is no religion in that religious affiliation box, if you assume that they are not spiritual, that's a good way to offend your patient. From a research perspective, it's all, however, a little bit more muddy. What we have done, we have cleaned out of the spirituality concept the religious properties, which is belonging and behaving and the search for the sacred. Okay? And what we have done is basically we have used a mental health definition, looking for meaning and purpose. That's actually the definition for mental health. So in order to accommodate spirituality for all kinds, we have basically borrowed from the mental health construct. Okay? Koenig is going into that definition muddiness, and I think it's important for researchers to know that, because if you find a statistically relevant relationship, a significant relationship between your spirituality measure and mental health, that's a tautology, right? I mean, because you're basically, in essence, measuring the same construct. I think from a user perspective, I think as clinicians, when we do clinical practice, we have to sort of be open and see where God is, where they are searching for God, where they are searching for meaning, and have conversations in the broadest sense. As a Christian, as someone who believes that God is in my life, I would want to listen very closely to where are they searching for the Father? Where is there the longing for the Father? Yeah? And give your patients the ability to express what matters to them right now and what they are grappling with, to provide that space. An integrated spirituality where the spiritual construct and the religion construct are sort of tied together is probably what most of us are most prepared to pick up. But we have to also learn a language with those who reject religion because religion has harmed them in the past and who only feel comfortable with spirituality. And I think that could be a space where we as Christians should make a contribution, where we should broaden the horizon of our healthcare professionals that we train and prepare them to be comfortable. Because if our graduates are not, the secular folks will not necessarily fill that void. And any healthcare provider who is anchored in a belief in a loving God has a lot to offer if they come alongside in a gentle and understanding way. Yes. Taylor.
I want to thank you for your insightful presentation this morning. As I've been involved in research in this institution, we've struggled in recent years over how to turn spirituality from an experience into an academic discipline. And what I saw this morning I find very encouraging. You're asking insightful questions and questions which can be measured. And I think this is a very important step forward. I commend you for it. Keep going.
Thank you very much. That means a lot. Dr. Branson.
I want to thank you for what you have brought to us this morning. And I would like to add something to it. It's presumptuous of me.
Oh, no. This is good.
But 40 years ago, on this campus, there was a lecture given by a visiting celebrity, actually, on the question of spirituality. And we had invited him to come from the Council on Spiritual Emphasis for Campus. There was such a thing 40 years ago. Yes. And when I was arranging for him to come, because I was the one who actually extended the invitation, his name was Paul Eshelman. He was the spokesman for Campus Crusade for Christ. And we were asking him to help us, doctors and nurses, extend spiritual emphasis to our patients. I said, what should we advertise you as speaking on? And his answer to me on the phone was, advertise me as speaking on breaking the sound barrier. I said, this is not aviation. He said, no. But we had hoped from our council we might have 50 people up in the campus chapel. In fact, the chapel was packed with 250 people, and there were 100 outside who couldn't get in. There was a need, a hunger on campus for this emphasis. Paul Eshelman ended up speaking on the sound barrier by telling us that when he is speaking to professional people, that is, doctors and nurses, the biggest barrier for them is finding the words at the critical moment. And his closing urging was that we all should actually prepare a witness, something that we can say or pray, and practice it, and do it seriously before a mirror if necessary, because otherwise when the critical moment comes, you will be stuck for words, and they won't come out easily. So that was how Paul Eshelman broke the sound barrier. And he did that, and I tell you what, there were 300 people there listening to that lecture who didn't want to leave. They wanted to pummel him with questions. So there is a need, and thank you for responding to that need today.
Thank you very much. I sometimes wonder whether we as faculty even need to be awakened again by the spirituality of Generation Z and the millennials. I'm wondering, maybe we're going to see something that we have not seen in a while and have not expected. Maybe it is the new generation who is going to pave the way so that we will again have, at the grassroots level, talk about spirituality and our own spiritual experience.
Because I do have the microphone, I do have one last question. It's really not so much a question, but this reminds me of 35 years ago when I was pastoring, and I went to hear Granger Westberg, who was a Lutheran minister. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that name. Lutheran Hospital in the Chicago area, talking about the role of spirituality and the role of chaplains in working in hospitals. Of course, there was some discussion then whether or not that the position of a chaplain should even be paid for by governmental funds. You said, what role do they play? But I think one of the things that I did learn is you got to learn to pray for the patient, not evangelistically and to save their soul at that point, but to bring them comfort in their hour of distress. So we have to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves in that regard.
I want to thank you so much for coming. It's been very interesting.
Enjoyed it to be with you.
We are having, again, for those of you who didn't know when I announced in the beginning, Nick Samuelyuk, okay, I forgot already, next week, and friends, an Adventist case for being pro-life. March 2nd is Barbara Cowden Hernandez back on this topic of spirituality and health. And then our own Rodney Corker will be talking about neuroplasticity, theology, and morality. I also wanted to reiterate that one of our own class members has returned a couple of books for somebody who didn't get one, if they would like to borrow that and read it. And I probably won't have a 5-phase prayer in closing, so I'm glad that slide isn't still up, but I will have a closing prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much that we can get together among friends and to discuss very important things such as spirituality and health, how it impacts us, how it impacts those that we care for. We ask that you will be with us the rest of this wonderful Sabbath day. And while we appreciate the rain, I'm so glad to see some today.